ReefDudes is sponsored by Ecotech Marine and Bulk Reef Supply. Today we're checking out the Nicrew HyperReef 200. What's going on, guys? Devin from ReefDudes. So years ago we actually checked out the original Nicrew lights, which were pretty solid bang for your buck lights. Like, I actually really did like them. The controller was a bit lacking, but the lights themselves were pretty awesome. And that was a few years back. So this is what, 4 years later since they released original HyperReef lights. So this is the Gen 2, and this is the 200 watt fixture. So this is kind of the bigger boy of the group. They do have a 100, 150, and a 200 watt model. Does show you the LED spread on the back. And our spectrum chart. And we also have an all new controller, which looks way easier than the old dial of the old school one. Uses the proven popular AB Plus spectrum. So they're taking the Ecotech spectrum on this one, the AB Plus. I always do wonder how close it is. I know a lot of people just copy the percentages, but I do wonder how that spectrum graph overlays with it. So what intensity is suitable for corals? That's a good starter range. Soft corals 75 to 150. LPS 75 to 150, SPS 200 to 300. Personally, whenever I'm tuning lights, I always shoot for around 100 par at the sand bed. That tends to work out pretty well. Opening the box, we got our mounting instructions, our quick start guide, got our buttons, increase intensity up or down by 5%, troubleshooting. Got our mounting system, which looks surprisingly similar to our Radeon. And the fixture itself. So this guy is the 200 watt version with the 3 pucks in it. And there is also a 100 and a 150 watt, which just has 2 pucks, so it'll be a bit smaller, about that size. So we do have our LED clusters. Now the original ones had a 90-degree lens on them. This one has a 120-degree. So you are going to get more spread, and it should be less hot spotty from the wider spectrum as well. Looks like we got our heatsink with the active cooling in the middle. And if we go down a layer, we got our mount inside of the box. It looks like we have little set screws inside where to kind of pin it in place and mount it. A little hole to poke the cord through, and our mounting at the top, which looks like it will slide into this bar. So very similar to the Radeon style mounting. Actually kind of interesting, different combinations for the bracket for if it's rimless, rimmed against a wall to get a little more height out of it. It's kind of funky how they do with the mount for the different options to fit your scenario. I'm of course curious to see how the light actually looks, so let's plug this baby in. Let there be light. So let's have the tank right behind me. Let's take a quick peek. Definitely pretty white on full spectrum. Now there is a USB-C cable on the light and one on the controller. Not sure if this is for charging it or controlling it, but let's plug it in and find out. This is the new controller. It is not touchscreen. You do have to use the arrows. Let's try going to manual. Turn the whites down a bit. It's funny, we got max and AB plus on here. Okay, so that's max on all channels. And this would be AB plus, which is basically max on the violets and the blues, and 25% on the rest. So let me get this mounted on the tank and then we'll do a bit of a part test with it. Okay, so this right now is 100% all channels. As you can see, this is 100% Radeon mount compatible, as I'm using my XR30 mount and I just popped one off. Very similar in height. The design, you know, it's pretty close in that perspective. So now this guy, 100%. I will say the fan's definitely a little bit louder than I would prefer at this intensity. So now let's turn it to AB+, which I'm gonna say it's a little more whiter. Keep in mind this is my schedule, so it's tweaked AB+, but it's AB+-ish. This one has a little more, I think I say a little more blue hue, where this one's still a little more whiter. So not quite the same, just looking from coral to coral. So let me do a little bit of tweaking on what I think would look similar. Could be different spectrums of blue, but I currently have violets at 100, blues at 100, warm whites at 11, greens at 6, and reds at 12, and it's starting to look similar. Still not quite there, but starting to be a bit closer. Camera doesn't quite pick up with the ICs, but the next important part, let's pop out the par meter and see what we're getting. All right, so temporarily turned off all the other Radeons. This is kind of the setting what I thought looked closest to AB+. So let's just take a quick par test on it. So on top of the Zorock, we're getting about 230 par. The sand bed, see as close as I can get to directly under it, we're getting about 180. So I could turn this down a bit. So right here I'm getting about 200, come on the glass, 240, 250, 230. So it's pretty good for spread. Drops down here, we're getting about 175 and 130. So this light supposedly has about 3 feet of spread. Now that would be the other direction. I do have it side to side right now, so it'll be a little bit less. But as we take, just as a bit of a baseline, we'll set this down here. And I'm currently getting, make sure it's not shadowed. So we're currently getting about 190 par. And this is on the setting that I thought looked closest to AB+. That was about 100% on violet, 100% on blue, 11 on white, 6 on green, and 12 on red. Now, I'm going to put down to the built-in AB+, which is going to bump up the levels a bit. And now we went from about 180, 190 to about 212. And if I put it on max, so we'll see the maximum par we get out of it. Now we're up to about 310. So 300 of the sand bed. There's definitely no shortage of par to this fixture. That being said, this is far too warm that I think anyone actually using a reef tank. So let's go back to the built-in AB+, because that's probably about 90% of people are going to use. And if I stick to the stock AB+, we're getting about 212 at the sand bed, which means we can drop this down a bit. Generally, I do say 100 at the sand bed's a pretty good place to be. So let's drop, say, the violet down. I'm gonna drop it down to about 75%. One nice to have, I wish the controller had a way to pick your schedule and drop the overall intensity. That would be nice to have rather than have to go through each point, but maybe you can do that in the schedule. Right now we're just playing in the manual settings. Okay, so this looks like something that reasonable brightness that I'd run it at, 120 at the sand bed, and I currently have it on 60% for violets and blues, 10% warm whites, 29% greens and 12% reds. Probably drop the greens a smidge. And that's giving us about 120 par at the sand bed. I do rotate this. Okay, now that we have it horizontal, it'll be a bit of a test more about spread. So this is about right in the middle of it. We got about 140 par. I'm just gonna try and hold it roughly the same spot in the glass. So we got 144. Come all the way over to the Ghani. We got about 55. I come over to this corner. We got about 150 off the glass. So that's probably what, 3 feet or so? Yeah, so you get about I'm gonna say 3 feet of good spread out of this light, which is pretty decent. You know, if you have that 2 to 3 foot tank, it'd be the one light could cover it all for you. Now that I did drop the settings down to more what I would use, the fan's still a little loud, but it's definitely much more reasonable. It was definitely on the loud side, 100%. But when you're running it at, you know, the 60-ish% for your blues and your violets and tone down on the rest, then it's actually getting much more reasonable. Okay, so I just set the time and date on this, set this up, and kind of clicking through the settings. So 8 o'clock, this is the default program. So 8 a.m. nothing, 10 a.m. we're at 55, 60, 528. That's for a violet, blue, white, green, red. And then by noon, bumps up, it's pretty warm, clear. A little more intensity around 2 p.m. 4 p.m., same thing, dials down a bit. Then around 5:30, it goes more the AB Plus look, which is funny because this is actually a similar look to what I manually programmed. And then after that, goes down to fairly blues and off. All right, guys, so what are the overall thoughts? The corals do look good under the lights. They have a nice spectrum of LEDs. Once you dial in the ratios to what your preference is, you know, there's some nice pop, there's some pretty good color rendition. That's pretty solid. I am curious if this can run without being plugged in. No. So I unplugged it and it looks like it went back to the default. So I might need this plugged in to actually run it. We do have buttons on top. All right, so buttons on top, you can go through it and get to a setting that you want. I don't know if it will do your program without the controller. You might be able to program it to it. Let's plug it back in. Okay, so looking at the instructions, the light can be controlled manually or with a HyperReef controller. So if you don't have the HyperReef controller, I believe you're at the mercy of the buttons. You have to manually power cycle it on and off. Where if you have the controller, then you can do your program schedule. So that's one thing to note. So if you're buying this, unless you just want on and off with a timer, you definitely will want this controller. Now it does look like it does need to be plugged in, so that's something to keep in mind. So you will have the 2 wires coming out of the light. That being said, it does have very nice color rendition. Build quality seems pretty solid overall, like it seems well made, you know, feels like it has decent heft to it. My only, I guess, one little complaint was I wish the fan was a bit quieter on it. It's a little bit louder than I'm used to, but I'm also a little bit OCD about trying to make my tank as sound as possible. So some people might not care, but that's something that always stands out to me. It would be nice if the controller was wireless, like it didn't need to be plugged into the light. Not the end of the world, because you're gonna have a wire coming off it anyways for power, but it would be nice if it didn't have to. The other thing would be nice, it'd be nice if you unplugged it and it kept your schedule, but as far as I can tell, so far at least, it looks like this has to be plugged into it to run your program. Now there is 2 USB-C ports on it, so if you had multiple fixtures, you could daisy chain them together for control purposes. So I believe the 100 did roughly 2 foot by 2 foot, the 150 did about 30 by 30, and the 200, which is this model, does 36 by 36. So you get roughly 3 feet out of coverage out of it. So coverage wise, it's pretty solid. It's pretty good for like the power spectrum, like moving it around. How even it is, it definitely falls off a bit on the edge, but overall it's fairly consistent. It's definitely less hot spotty than the original models, so that's been a big improvement. All right guys, so now overall thoughts now that we've been playing with this for a bit. The build quality on the light is pretty solid. Overall, I would say, you know, aesthetically it looks good. It's pretty dang similar to a Radeon. Uses the same mounting system, same spacing. You know, when I had on the tank, I just mounted on the Radeon lights. So that is pretty similar from that perspective. Looking at the bottom, you know, we got our 3 different pucks on this one. This is the 200 watt model. Again, the 100 and 150 would just have the 2 pucks. Now, my only really gripe would be I wish the fans were a bit quieter. When at 100% or the AB Plus preset on manual was pretty dang loud. When I dropped it down to normal schedule, it was a lot more reasonable. You know, if it's in, you know, a big area or a busy place, you're not going to notice. But if it's, you know, in a quiet bedroom, you're going to notice. So it kind of depends on your use case and where you're using it. We do have the USB ports on the back, USB-C, and this is for daisy chaining the lights or hooking up the Spectro controller. Now this controller, I do wish it was wireless and didn't need to be plugged into the lights. With that being said, it is a pretty good upgrade for programmability versus the old one. The screen is nice and it's a little nicer to use and program with that little kind of color display rocking you through it. It does have a nice magnetic mount, which is nice, but would be nice if it was wireless, or you could do it through an app. So those are my little mini gripes, but otherwise, it's a pretty solid, you know, light, especially for the price. Again, don't know the price, but historically off the Nicrew products were a pretty good bang for your buck. Looking back at, you know, the older models and the prior ones. So they're definitely pretty solid in the value perspective. So yeah, if there's anything else you guys want me to test on this, let me know. Otherwise, I'll drop a link in the description below if you want to check it out further. As always, if you enjoyed this, be sure to hit that like button. You need to make sure to subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next video.